The title of today's reflection is Use What You Have. The Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament reading for today is 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 to 44. A man from the town of Baal Shalisha brought Elisha some freshly cut grain and 20 loaves of bread made from the first barley that was harvested. Elisha said, "Give it to the people so they can eat." "There's not enough here for 100 people," his servant said. "Just give it to them," Elisha responded. "The Lord has promised there'll be more than enough." So servant served the bread and grain to the people, and they ate and still had some left over, just as the Lord had promised. Jesus crossed Lake Galilee. That's the beginning of the story from the Gospel of St. John. John chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Jesus crossed the Lake of Galilee, which was also known as Lake Tiberias. A large crowd had seen him work miracles to heal the sick, and those people went to him. It was almost time for the Jewish festival of Passover, and Jesus went up on a mountain with his disciples and sat down. When Jesus saw the large crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, "Where will we get enough food to feed all the people?" He said this to test Philip, since he already knew what he was going to do. Miracles of feeding and miracles in general are not just a New Testament Christian scriptures thing. There are examples of miracles in the Hebrew scriptures as well. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 to 44 is an example of the Hebrew scriptures. A story of the multiplication of food to feed 100 people is found in 2 Kings chapter 4. The narrative is part of the Revised Common Lectionary reading for this week. I think it's included in the Revised Common Lectionary because the miracle reminds us of a miracle, the feeding of 5,000, found in John chapter 6. I'm going to briefly review the miracles in 2 Kings chapter 4 because I think they're relevant to an application that we might find in John chapter 6's story of the feeding of the 5,000. Chapter 4 of 2 Kings is full of miracles. The first miracle takes place after a man dies. One of his creditors goes to his wife and demands payment. The creditor is planning on taking her sons as slaves to pay the debt. She cries out to Elisha, "All the woman has is oil." Elisha multiplies the oil to the point where there is enough oil to pay for the debt her husband owed and enough money left over for her family to live off. A second miracle is when Elisha raises the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. Elisha stretches himself upon the boy. The first time he stretched himself upon the boy's body, the body grew warm. The second time, the boy sneezed and opened his eyes. The third miracle takes place when a poisonous soup is made harmless by Elisha. And the fourth miracle is the miracle of the multiplying of the bread so there's enough for everyone. According to the narrative of the multiplying of the bread in 2 Kings, there's not enough food for 100 men. When a servant complains there's not enough food, the servant is told the food is to be given to the people and there'll be food left over. There's an important element in the story in 2 Kings that we might miss. Verse 42 tells us a man came from Baal Salisha with the offering of his first fruits for the harvest. The first fruit for the harvest offering was brought to a priest, and the first fruits were brought to Elisha, possibly because Elisha might have been thought to be a priest or a prophet for Baal, one of the Canaanite gods. Elisha tells the man to give the food to the 100 hungry men. The word Lord is used twice in the story. Contributors to the New Interpreter's Study Bible wonder if it's a veiled criticism of Baal worship. The New Interpreter's Study Bible is correct? Possibly. And if they're correct, the story might be making the point that the God of Israel, the God that the Israelites worshipped, could do something with the offering of the first fruits that the god Baal could not do. In the two miracles, Elisha multiplies what the people already have. The woman has some oil. She didn't even have enough containers to store the oil. So Elisha asks her to go to her neighbors and borrow containers for oil. He cautions her not to get too few containers. Sure, she and her sons borrow containers for oil from their neighbors. Then she pours oil from her container into all of the vessels. As she pours the oil, there's more oil to pour into the vessels. The woman tells Elisha that all of the available containers were full, and Elisha tells her to pay off the debt by selling the oil and then live off the proceeds from selling the remaining oil. A second miracle is when Elisha multiplies the food that the people already had, so it was possible to feed 100 men. A man has brought some grain and bread, and Elisha multiplies that to be enough to feed 100. And Elisha tells him to feed the people, and there will be food left over. The feeding of the 100 sounds very much like the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. In the gospel reading, Jesus asked Philip where they could get that kind of food in the area. Evidently, Philip was from the general area. It made some sense to ask a person whose home turf was only about 9 miles away. According to St. John's narrative, Jesus was testing Philip because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. The disciples had a practical solution, one that worked. Just send the people away. That solution is seen in Matthew and Mark's accounts of the story. Jesus did not send the people away. Jesus wasn't the kind of individual to send people away who were physically or spiritually hungry. That's not the way of Jesus, and I don't think it should be the way for those who follow Christ. Instead of sending them away, Jesus wants to feed the people. When Jesus tells the disciples to feed the people, Philip points out that it would take about a year's worth of wages to buy that much food. Andrew finds a boy who has some bread and some fish. Jesus blesses the food and starts giving out the food. There was more than enough food for everyone. According to John's narrative, there were 12 large baskets of food left over. In the story, a contrast can be made between the disciples and the boy. The disciples were people of far more financial means than the boy. They choose to do nothing because they knew they didn't have enough. The boy gave what little he had, and Christ blessed it and multiplied it and made the gift work. In the gospel story, Jesus asked the disciples to do what is impossible. Over the years, many times I've heard people say, God never asks us to do what is impossible. I believe that God often asks us to do what is impossible, so we give up and let God perform an incredible miracle. Some Jewish people might have been expecting the Messiah to be very much like Moses, miraculously providing food for them every day. Because the miracle, the feeding of 5,000, in this chapter, Jesus is able to say that he is the bread of life. The key difference between the manna that Moses and God provided for the children of Israel each day when they were in the desert is that the bread of life that Jesus gave provided power to give life that triumphs over death. When we start, there's never enough, but then something happens. And there's a miracle that multiplies our efforts. Crystal Sparks posts some YouTube devotional thoughts. Regarding the narrative in 2 Kings chapter 4, she observes, use what you have. I'm going to give a few examples of people who used what they had. The small church had bought a lot. They'd even bought some wood, some lumber to start construction on a church building. Due to some kind of deep divisions in the church, which I never learned about, the building project stopped. It stalled. For years, nothing happened. I added a little bit of money to the fund. At a couple of business meetings, people noticed the money in the fund was increasing. And people started to dream again. People started cleaning highways, raising money, donating money. In a few years, they were meeting in a new building. Seed money was really all I had. And God multiplied the seed money. There's an old legend about the college I attended. Many years ago, the college purchased a brand new 9-foot Chickering concert grand piano. Not long after this big grand piano was purchased, a fire broke out in the main building on campus. The main building burned to the ground. According to the legend, 2 students used what they had to move the piano out to safety. The students had nothing but physical strength. Legend has it that they picked that piano up high enough to get it to clear the seats that were bolted to the floor of the chapel in that building, and they carried the piano out to safety. I've played that grand many times. I have just a wee bit of a sense of the weight of that monster grand. I'm not saying the students didn't carry it out, but I cannot picture how 2 students could possibly have picked that grand piano up and moved it out. Betty Williams had a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. Her paternal grandfather was attacked because his son married a Catholic. Protestants killed one cousin and Catholics killed another. In 1976, she witnessed the killing of 3 children in what some might describe as sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. Betty organized a petition. She did not have much, but she gave what she had, armed with not much more than shock, horror, anger, and grief. She started collecting signatures to protest sectarian violence. She collected thousands of signatures and helped organize women's marches for peace in Northern Ireland. The first march had over 10,000 Catholic and Protestant mothers. The second march, a week later, had 35,000 participants. The protesters demanded that the violence stop. Betty Williams won a Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to end sectarian violence. During the pandemic, Josh Helgoth moved out of New York City so he could be in a safer area during the pandemic. TikTok is a popular social media platform. Josh Helgoth started a TikTok channel. He brought what he had: time, energy, and passion. He wanted his channel to help LGBT plus youth. He now has 4.3 million followers on TikTok, and his videos have been liked 275 million times. We can apply this principle to our personal lives and to our life of community faith. A few events of the last year might be enough to bring you to the table so that God can multiply what you bring. Examples of some of the things you might bring to God to multiply include your shock, grief, and trauma regarding the unmarked graves found at former residential schools for Indigenous children. Anger over the hate crimes that have taken the lives of Muslims and Black people. A shared vision for the renewal of our church. Passion to feed the hungry and to house the homeless. Today, in some way, God is asking us to bring a lunch fit for a party of one. Some fish, some bread, so God can perform a miracle. What are you bringing for God to make a miracle from?